Not long ago, we spoke about the dogs who worked in World War I, a very fascinating topic, and many countries in Europe did indeed use dogs. And we wondered, and you may have wondered, how were dogs used in the Second World War? Well, I'm very pleased to have the perfect person to answer this. His name is Trevor Jones, and Trevor is the director and CEO of History Nebraska. He's an award-winning author of numerous books and articles, and he has got a lot of experience in working as a museum curator, designer, and educator. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, so let's talk about the programs that employed dogs, United States-based dogs in World War II, please.
Absolutely. The program in World War II was called Dogs for Defense, and it was unique. It's the only time in American history that this has happened. So when we entered World War II, we were fighting a war on two fronts, and suddenly it was clear that anything that the American military could do to free up soldiers to fight was a good thing for us to do. And so the thought was, if we use dogs to patrol military installations, or to go on patrols, or detect landmines, or to carry bandages for hospitals, anything that dogs could do would be helpful for the war effort. And there was only one really major problem with that, was that the U.S. military had no dogs whatsoever. It had no dog training program, no animals, nothing. And suddenly they were confronted with this gap. And so what they did was they asked the people of the United States to donate their pets to the military and serve in the armed forces. And so what happened was, by the thousands, people donated their dogs, their own family dogs, their pets, and they shipped them off in crates on trains, and they shipped them primarily to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, western part of Nebraska, and they trained them to be soldiers. And those dogs served in every theater of World War II. That had been family pets earlier, and then they were trained to be soldiers, and then they served in combat. They served to guard installations. They did all kinds of things.
How do you train a dog for service?
They had a training program, and at the beginning, I want you to imagine that they were so desperate, they didn't really think a lot about breeds, and they didn't think, they thought if the dog was big enough, if it weighed enough, that was fine. And so they had dogs that you would think of as service dogs today, like Dalmatians, they had Dalmatians, they had German Shepherds, they had Great Danes, they had Poodles, they had everything that you could think of, and they tried to train them to do these different functions. So there was basically, just like it was for human soldiers at the time, there was basic dog training that they did, which was about a 6-week course. And if the dog passed basic training, then it would go on to advanced training, just like soldiers did, to go off to advanced infantry school or whatever. And those dogs would then get trained to be a scout dog, or they get trained to be a attack dog, or they get trained to be a mine detecting dog. And so that's how they did it. And at Fort Robinson, at any given time, they would have 6,000 dogs there together, all in training at one time. So the scale was enormous.
Is there an individual who spearheaded this? How did this all come together?
There were different people that certainly had this idea and sold the U.S. government on it. One of the most important ones was a woman named Aline Erlanger, and she was a dog breeder, and she believed strongly in the power of dogs to do all kinds of things. And she was a huge proponent of the Dogs for Defense program, and she was a great publicist. So one of the things that they did was they got movie stars to donate their dogs to the program, and then they got media attention about the movie stars donating the dogs, and they got Purina to do a corporate sponsorship of the program. So they were very savvy to get the American people on board with this. Yeah. And they embraced it. People did embrace it. It was not easy. It was not easy then, as you can imagine. Not easy to give up your pet for something larger, with no guarantee that your pet's ever going to come safely home. But the American people did this. They embraced this challenge.
Do we know how many of the dogs did not make it back?
The figures are a bit sketchy. The military did not keep all of the, super accurate figures on this. So it's a little bit hard to tell in exact numbers. About, say 50% of the dogs actually made it through the training program. So, not every dog was taken, and they would send them home at government expense. So if you donated your pet in 1943 and your dog didn't, couldn't hack it, they would send your dog back to you and say, good try. And certainly, it's hard to know, but thousands of dogs did die in World War II, and some were killed in combat, some were killed in accidents. A lot of them, just like soldiers in every war, died of disease. Distemper was a big challenge in World War II. So you had no guarantee that your dog would come home at the end of the conflict, and many dogs did not.
Yeah, and the dogs needed to be debriefed, as it were, when they came back.
Yes, absolutely. And this is my favorite part of the program, because it seems so strange that they would do this today. But the government felt very strongly that the American people had donated their dogs, and so they were alone, and they had a responsibility to them. So when the war ended and they didn't need these dogs anymore, the military decided we need to give these back to the people that donated them. So they sent them all of these dogs that survived went back to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and they went through a detraining period so they could become pets again. So if you had donated your dog to this program in 1943, in 1945, when the war ended, 75 years ago now, nearly exactly, then your dog would get shipped back to you at government expense. And not only would it come back to you, it would be really well trained, and you'd get a little doggy discharge paper, discharge certificate saying that your dog had served honorably in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, just like any veteran would, any human veteran. So they really cared about this. And I think, today, you might think of military assets as being like a tank or a plane. When you're done with it, you just discard it. But in that time, they really felt like the American people gave up their pets, and so we owe it to them to return those pets in the best condition we have. And so, the book that I've written about this, it's a true story about a dog that was given up. And when that dog comes home, the actual true story about that is when the dog came back after World War II, that the little boy who donated, his dad used to take it down to the local bar and have Major do tricks for the different people at the bar, just to show what a well-trained dog that he was. He was the best trained dog in the county. So there was a lot of pride in having your dog serve in World War II.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it. You are a serious historian, but you did see an opportunity to write a really charming illustrated children's book. And I'm glad you did it, because a lot of the books we get are really about nothing. And this really says something. So thank you for putting that out there.
Yeah, I mean, the reason behind doing the children's book, telling the story about Dogs for Defense and people donating their dogs in World War II, is I wanted to get at these ideas of patriotism and sacrifice. And I think those are abstract concepts even for adults to understand a lot of times, and for kids even harder to say, what does it mean to sacrifice something for something you believe in? But when you phrase that question, as I often do, is, would you give up your pet to help your country? Or would you give up your pet for something larger than yourself? That becomes very concrete, because we love our pets. I mean, that's your family. And that brings an abstract concept very much to the concrete. And that's why I wanted to do this as a children's book, to say people actually did this, and think about what this meant to people at that time. If you love your dog or your cat or whatever, would you give it up for something with no guarantee that it's going to come back to you safely, with the idea that that's a sacrifice for a larger good? And that's a really tough question to answer. And I ask that question pretty much every time I talk with people about this. And I say, would you give up your pet to help your country? And honestly, the answer most of the time I hear is no way.
Okay, so we've got this well-established program. The war ends, and so what happens to this program? Have we learned anything that we take forward as a society, or perhaps in law enforcement, or even in the military itself?
Well, in a lot of ways, yes, because they had to develop the dog training program on the fly during World War II. And they wrote a manual, and it was called, in typical military speak, Technical Manual, War Dogs. And that was the sort of the training Bible that they put together in World War II. And that document basically becomes the basis for how service dogs get trained after World War II and how military dogs get trained. And one of the important things to note is that, a lot of the people that trained dogs in World War II went on to civilian careers, and they trained dogs for the visually impaired, and they trained military dogs, and they used those same techniques. And one of the key parts of that is they decided early on in World War II, and this was not the way that dog training was necessarily done previous to this, but they decided that you could not have a good relationship with a dog if it was built on fear, that it had to be built on reward and trust. And then so the dog handler and the dog needed to work together as a unit. And that has been the key for service and military dog training since World War II. But prior to that point, there was a lot of thought about that you needed to basically break the dog and sort of, beat the dog until the dog gave up, and then you'd build that dog back. And what they discovered was that did not work, that the dog needed that level of encouragement and trust. And so that manual, that technical manual, became the basis for dog training. We've improved that radically since then. But if you're looking for the origins of service dog training and military dog training, you can really look back to the American experience in World War II and say these are the lessons that they learned then.
We have been speaking with Trevor Jones. He is with History Nebraska. How can people find History Nebraska online?
If you go to history.nebraska.gov, you can see about Fort Robinson, Nebraska. It's a historic site that we operate. You can go still tour where they train these dogs and see artifacts from that time period. You can also see pictures of the War Dog program if you just type in War Dogs into our search bar. And you can see the actual pictures of them training dogs and doing all kinds of things. So if you want to do that, if you're interested in purchasing a soldier dog, you can go to history.nebraska.gov/books and buy it there. Independent booksellers everywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's a fascinating little unknown American story.
Indeed it is. Thank you very much for joining us on Animals Today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.